new first-time worn on the show, and you bring out a sloppy Pikachu.
You thought you knew Johnny Carson, the charming king of late night. But what if The Tonight Show wasn't all laughs? Behind the cameras lurked feuds, scandals, and shocking secrets Carson fought to keep buried. Affairs, betrayals, backstage wars, stories so wild they were never meant to be told. This isn't the Johnny Carson you grew up with. This is the truth Hollywood tried to hide.
No, I didn't say 7 or 8. I said several.
Then you said 7 or 8, and I said
Did I?
9.
Nine. Good.
When television viewers across America heard those famous words, they knew they were in for something special. For 3 decades, from 1962 to 1992, Johnny Carson became more than just a talk show host. He became a trusted companion who invited himself into millions of homes every weeknight, bringing with him a unique blend of Midwestern charm, razor-sharp wit, and approachable personality that made viewers feel like they were catching up with an old friend. Carson wasn't just another entertainer on the small screen, he was the undisputed king of late-night television, a title that wasn't just handed to him but earned through years of consistent excellence and an uncanny ability to connect with audiences from all walks of life. But whether you were a night owl, an insomniac, or someone winding down after a long day, Carson had this remarkable talent for making you feel like you belonged in his world, even if that world was just a television studio in Burbank, California. What made Carson truly special wasn't just his comedy or his interviewing skills, though both were exceptional. It was his ability to create a sense of intimacy through the television screen. When he delivered his nightly monologue or chatted with guests, it felt natural and unforced. There was something genuinely comforting about his presence, a quality that modern talk show hosts still try to capture decades later. But here's something that might surprise you about the man who seemed so warm and friendly on camera. According to multiple sources and former colleagues, Carson was quite different when the red recording light wasn't on. Behind the scenes, he was known to be rather distant, sometimes difficult, and surprisingly capable of holding grudges that could last for years. This contrast between his public persona and private personality would lead to some fascinating conflicts and surprising feuds throughout his career, including some shocking falling outs with people who were once considered close friends and frequent collaborators. To understand how Carson came to dominate late-night television for such an unprecedented length of time, we need to look back at how this whole concept of late-night talk shows even began. The story doesn't start with Carson, though. It actually began nearly a decade earlier, with a different host in a different era of television, when the medium itself was still finding its footing and experimenting with new formats. The late-night talk show format as we know it today was essentially invented by a man named Steve Allen. In July 1953, Allen started hosting a local late-night program on WNBT-TV in New York City, which was NBC's flagship station. The show was simply called The Steve Allen Show, and aired from 11:20 p.m. to midnight. Allen, who was already known for his quick wit and musical abilities, brought something completely new to television. He combined comedy monologues, celebrity interviews, musical performances, and spontaneous interactions with a studio audience in a way that had never been done before on television. The local New York show was such a hit that NBC executives quickly recognized its potential. On September 27, 1954, the network launched a national version of Allen's program, now called simply Tonight. This first network episode of what would eventually become The Tonight Show was broadcast live from the Hudson Theater in New York City and ran for an impressive 105 minutes, much longer than today's typical hour-long format. Allen's opening words that first night turned out to be remarkably prophetic. Sitting at his piano, he told the audience, "This is tonight. And I can't think of too much to tell you about it, except I want to give you the bad news first. This program is going to go on forever." While Allen was likely just joking about the show's lengthy runtime that evening, his words proved to be incredibly accurate in a way he probably never expected. Steve Allen's version of Tonight established virtually every element that we still associate with late-night talk shows today. He pioneered the opening monologue, where the host would deliver a series of jokes about current events and popular culture. He created the now familiar setup of having celebrity guests come out for interviews, sitting on a couch next to the host's desk. He incorporated musical performances from both established stars and up-and-coming artists. He even took cameras outside the studio for comedy sketches, something that was quite innovative for television at the time. Allen was joined by announcer Gene Rayburn, who would later become famous as the host of the game show Match Game, and bandleader Skitch Henderson. The show also featured regular musical performers Steve Lawrence and Heidi Gourmet, who later became a successful married couple and recording duo. This combination of personalities created a lively, unpredictable atmosphere that kept viewers tuned in night after night. However, Allen's time as the host of Tonight was relatively brief. In 1956, NBC gave Allen his own Sunday night variety show, The Steve Allen Show, which was designed to compete directly with CBS's enormously popular Ed Sullivan Show. Initially, Allen tried to do both programs, hosting Tonight 5 nights a week and the Sunday variety show as well, but by 1957, NBC decided that Allen needed to focus all his energy on the Sunday night program, so they removed him from Tonight in January of that year. The decision to replace Allen led to a period of experimentation that shows just how uncertain NBC was about what the late-night audience wanted. Rather than immediately finding another comedy-focused host, the network completely changed the show's format. They renamed it Tonight America After Dark and turned it into something more like a news and features program similar to NBC's morning show today. This new version was hosted first by Jack Lascouli, who was also a regular on the Today Show, and later by Al Jazzbo Collins. The program featured interviews conducted by Hy Gardner with music from various small jazz ensembles. But this news-oriented approach was a complete failure with audiences. Many NBC affiliates across the country actually dropped the show from their schedules because it wasn't attracting enough viewers to justify the airtime. Recognizing their mistake, NBC quickly returned to a comedy and entertainment format in July 1957. This time they brought in Jack Paar as the host, and he would take the show in a somewhat different direction than Allen had. Paar was more conversational than Allen, placing greater emphasis on interviews and discussion rather than comedy sketches and musical numbers. He welcomed a mix of entertainers, authors, and political figures, creating a more sophisticated atmosphere that appealed to viewers who wanted something a bit more substantial than pure entertainment. During Parr's tenure, which lasted until 1962, some future stars made early appearances that would help launch their careers. Carol Burnett, who would later become one of television's most beloved comedians, was a frequent guest. Liza Minnelli appeared on the show as a young performer. Even Bob Hope, who would later have a complicated relationship with Johnny Carson, was a regular guest during Parr's time as host. But Parr, despite his success, eventually decided he wanted a less demanding schedule. By 1962, he was ready to step away from the nightly grind of hosting Tonight in favor of a weekly primetime variety show that would allow him more time with his family. His departure created the opportunity that would change Johnny Carson's life and, ultimately, the entire landscape of late-night television. After Parr announced his departure, NBC faced the challenge of finding yet another host for their late-night franchise. They had learned from the America After Dark experiment that audiences definitely wanted entertainment rather than news in the late-night hours. They had also seen that both Allen and Parr had succeeded in different ways, suggesting that there might be multiple approaches to hosting a successful late-night talk show. The man they chose to take over was relatively unknown to most television audiences, but he had been steadily building a reputation in the entertainment industry. Johnny Carson had been working in television since the early 1950s, starting with local programs in California and Nebraska before moving to network television. He had hosted a game show called Who Do You Trust on ABC, where he had developed his skills at ad-libbing and interviewing guests. It was also on this show that he first worked with Ed McMahon, who served as the program's announcer and would later become Carson's famous sidekick and the man behind that iconic introduction. Carson's background was quite different from both Allen and Parr. He had grown up in Nebraska, giving him a distinctly Midwestern sensibility that would prove to appeal to a broad cross-section of American viewers. He had served in the Navy during World War II and had worked in radio before transitioning to television. He also had experience as a magician, which gave him a performer's understanding of timing and audience psychology that would serve him well as a talk show host. When Carson took over Tonight on October 1, 1962, he was stepping into a role that had already been proven successful, but was still evolving. The format that Allen had created and Parr had refined was now Carson's to make his own. That first episode featured an impressive array of guests. Singer Rudy Valley, actor and filmmaker Mel Brooks, crooner Tony Bennett, and Hollywood legend Joan Crawford. It was a lineup that showcased the variety and star power that would become hallmarks of Carson's version of the show. What Johnny Carson accomplished when he took over The Tonight Show, 1962, was nothing short of revolutionary. While Steve Allen had invented the late-night talk show format and Jack Pa had refined it, Carson perfected it in a way that created a blueprint still followed by every major late-night host today. The structure he developed was deceptively simple, yet incredibly effective, and it would prove so enduring that hosts like Jimmy Fallon, Stephen Colbert, and Jimmy Kimmel continue to use variations of the same format more than 60 years later. Carson's show always began the same way. After Ed McMahon's famous introduction, Carson would walk out from behind the curtain, acknowledge the audience, and launch into his opening monologue. This wasn't just any collection of jokes, though. Carson developed a very specific approach to the monologue that became a masterclass in comedy timing and audience engagement. He would deliver between 16 and 22 rapid-fire one-liners, carefully crafted to cover current events, popular culture, and whatever was making headlines that day. The key to Carson's monologue success was a rule he strictly enforced: never more than 3 jokes on the same subject. This prevented any topic from wearing out its welcome and kept the pace moving at exactly the right speed. Whether he was making fun of politicians, celebrities, or current events, Carson knew when to move on before the audience got bored. This discipline in his comedy structure was one of the reasons his monologues remained fresh and engaging night after night for 30 years. What made Carson's monologues particularly special was his ability to handle jokes that didn't work. When a joke fell flat, which happened to every comedian, Carson had an almost supernatural ability to turn the failure into something even funnier than the original joke would have been. He'd give a look to the audience, make a self-deprecating comment, or deliver a perfectly timed reaction that would get bigger laughs than many of his successful jokes. This skill at recovering from comedic mishaps became one of his most beloved traits and showed audiences that he was quick-thinking and genuine. For the monologue, Carson would typically engage in some light banter with Ed McMahon and sometimes with bandleader Doc Severinsen, who had taken over from Skitch Henderson in 1967. These interactions weren't scripted, and they showcased Carson's ability to think on his feet and play off his colleagues' personalities. McMahon's boisterous laugh and enthusiastic responses provided the perfect counterpoint to Carson's more measured, dry wit. The show would then move into what became the standard talk show structure: guest interviews, comedy sketches, and musical performances, though not necessarily in that order every night. Carson deliberately kept the format flexible, understanding that the needs of each show were different, and that rigid structure could make the program feel stale. Some nights might feature multiple comedy segments, while others might focus more heavily on interviews or musical performances. Carson's approach to guest interviews was revolutionary for television at the time. Unlike many hosts who dominated conversations or stuck rigidly to pre-planned questions, Carson mastered the art of the conversational interview. He would ask open-ended questions and then actually listen to the responses, allowing guests to be funny or interesting on their own terms. He understood that his job wasn't to be the star of every segment, but rather to create an environment where his guests could shine. This interview style worked particularly well with comedians, many of whom credit Carson with launching their careers. When a comedian could make Carson genuinely laugh during their stand-up spot or interview, it was considered the ultimate seal of approval in the entertainment industry. Being invited to sit on Carson's couch after a successful stand-up performance was often a career-defining moment for aspiring comedians. The success of Carson's format wasn't accidental. It was carefully crafted with the help of a talented production team, most notably producer Fred DeCordova, who joined the show in 1970 and became executive producer in 1984. DeCordova was a seasoned television professional who had worked on numerous successful programs before joining The Tonight Show. His experience directing and producing shows like The George Burns and Gracie Allen Show and The Jack Benny program made him an ideal partner for Carson's vision. DeCordova described his role as being a chief traffic cop, talent scout, #1 fan, and critic, all rolled into one. He was responsible for booking guests, overseeing the production logistics, and ensuring that each show ran smoothly. During tapings, he would sit just off camera where he could communicate with Carson during commercial breaks and provide guidance when needed. The two men developed a professional relationship that worked well for over 20 years, though it wasn't without its complications. The relationship between Carson and DeCordova was generally positive, but it had its moments of tension. particularly as both men got older and Carson became more particular about how his show was run. De Cordova had to balance Carson's creative desires with the practical demands of television production, network requirements, and the need to book attractive guests that would draw viewers. This balancing act sometimes created friction, especially when outside pressures influenced who could or couldn't appear on the show. One area where this tension became apparent was in the booking of certain high-profile guests, particularly Bob Hope, who had become a source of ongoing frustration for Carson despite appearing on the show more than any other guest. Hope's relationship with NBC gave him special privileges that Carson found difficult to navigate, creating a situation that would test Carson's professionalism night after night. Bob Hope appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson more than 100 times, making him by far the most frequent guest in the show's history. On the surface, this might seem like evidence of a great friendship between two comedy legends. In reality, it represented one of Carson's most challenging professional relationships and a source of considerable behind-the-scenes tension that most viewers never suspected. The root of the problem was that Hope's frequent appearances weren't really Carson's choice. As NBC's biggest star for decades before Carson arrived, Hope had earned special privileges at the network that essentially allowed him to book himself on The Tonight Show whenever he had something to promote, and Hope always seemed to have something to promote, whether it was a television special, a book, or some other project. Carson's Tonight Show producer Peter LaSalle later revealed how these bookings typically worked. "We'd get a request," LaSalle recalled, "and Johnny would go, 'Again?' And I'd say, 'Do you want to tell him no?' And he'd say, 'No, you can't turn down Bob Hope.' This dynamic put Carson in an impossible position. He knew that refusing Hope could potentially damage his relationship with NBC executives, but he also knew that Hope's appearances were often difficult and unsatisfying from both a professional and creative standpoint. The fundamental problem was that Carson and Hope represented completely different approaches to comedy and entertainment. Carson valued spontaneity, quick thinking, and genuine conversation. He appreciated guests who could think on their feet, engage with current events, and participate in real dialogue during interviews. Hope, by contrast, came to every appearance with carefully prepared material written by his team of writers. He would provide Carson's staff with specific questions he wanted to be asked, and he expected the interview to follow that script exactly. This scripted approach frustrated Carson, who prided himself on his ability to conduct engaging, spontaneous conversations. Carson's former head writer Andrew Nichols later explained the disconnect. There was nothing spontaneous about Hope. He was a guy who relied on his writers for every topic. Johnny was very quick on his feet, very well read. He was a guy who learned Swahili, learned Russian, and learned astronomy. He appreciated people who he felt engaged with the real world. There was nothing to talk to Bob about. The situation became even more challenging as Hope aged. By the 1980s, Hope's hearing and eyesight were beginning to fail, which made the already scripted interviews even more rigid and difficult. Carson had to stick precisely to the predetermined questions, because if he deviated even slightly, Hope might become confused and answer a completely different question than the one that had been asked. These limitations made Hope's appearances feel increasingly awkward and stilted, especially compared to Carson's usually fluid interview style. Despite these professional frustrations, Carson maintained his composure during Hope's appearances, displaying the kind of professional courtesy that had made him successful. However, those close to Carson could see his true feelings. Producer Peter LaSalle noted that Johnny admired Hope's place in show business, but he was not a great admirer of his work. Carson recognized Hope's historical importance and contributions to entertainment, but he simply didn't enjoy working with him or find his comedy style particularly appealing. The tension between Carson and Hope reflected broader changes in the entertainment industry and comedy specifically. Hope represented the old school of entertainment, where performers relied heavily on writers and stuck to proven formulas that had worked for decades. Carson represented a newer approach that valued spontaneity, topical humor, and the ability to adapt and improvise in real time. These philosophical differences in comedy and performance made their professional relationship challenging, even though both men were consummate professionals who managed to work together successfully for many years. This dynamic with Hope was particularly frustrating for Carson because it highlighted how little control he sometimes had over his own show. Despite being the host and the star, there were still network politics and industry relationships that could override his preferences. The Hope situation was a reminder that even at the height of his success, Carson had to navigate complex professional relationships and accommodate guests he might not personally enjoy working with. The contrast between Carson's public graciousness toward Hope and his private frustrations also revealed something important about Carson's personality. He was capable of maintaining professional relationships even when they were personally challenging, but he also had strong opinions about comedy and entertainment that he didn't compromise easily. This ability to separate his personal feelings from his professional responsibilities was part of what made him such an effective host, but it also contributed to the sense that there was often more going on behind the scenes than audiences realized. The relationship between Carson and Hope would continue throughout Carson's entire tenure on The Tonight Show, representing a fascinating example of how professional obligations sometimes conflict with personal preferences, and how even the most successful entertainers have to deal with workplace relationships that are less than ideal. Carson's approach to handling politics on The Tonight Show was one of his most carefully calculated professional decisions, and it reveals a lot about his understanding of both television and his audience. In an era where political division wasn't quite as stark as it would become in later decades, Carson made a deliberate choice to keep his personal political views largely separate from his professional persona. This wasn't because he didn't have opinions, but because he understood something fundamental about the nature of entertainment and mass communication. In a 1979 interview with 60 Minutes, Carson explained his philosophy. Why do they think that just because you have a Tonight Show that you must deal in serious issues? It's a danger. It's a real danger. Once you start that, you start to get that self-important feeling that what you say has great import. And you know, strangely enough, you could use that show as a forum. You could sway people, and I don't think you should be an entertainer. This approach wasn't born out of political apathy or ignorance. Carson had strong personal views. According to his former lawyer, Henry Bushkin, he was by instinct and upbringing definitely Republican, but of an Eisenhower sort that we don't see much of anymore. Overall, you'd have to say he was anti-big government, anti-big money, anti-big bullies, anti-big blowhards. He opposed the Vietnam War, favored racial equality, and supported various social causes, but he kept these views largely private. Carson explained his reasoning in a 1970 interview. In my living room, I would argue for liberalization of abortion laws, divorce laws, and there are times when I would like to express a view on the air. I would love to have taken on Billy Graham, but I'm on TV 5 nights a week. I have nothing to gain by it and everything to lose. The strategy worked brilliantly for Carson's career and for NBC's bottom line. By avoiding divisive political stances, Carson was able to maintain an enormous audience that included people from across the political spectrum. This broad appeal was crucial to The Tonight Show's success as both a cultural phenomenon and a commercial enterprise. When Carson occasionally interviewed prominent politicians such as Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Robert F. Kennedy, and Hubert Humphrey, he refused to discuss his personal political views on the show out of concern it might alienate his audience, and resisted efforts from his writing staff, particularly head writer and admitted liberal Marshall Brickman, to include more political material in the show. This political neutrality extended beyond just avoiding controversial topics. It was part of Carson's broader professional approach that prioritized entertainment value and broad appeal over personal expression or advocacy. He understood that The Tonight Show served a particular function in people's lives. It was meant to be a pleasant way to end the day, not a forum for serious debate or political persuasion. However, Carson's commitment to political neutrality didn't mean he avoided all topical humor. His monologues regularly included jokes about current events and political figures, but he made sure to target everyone equally and focus on the absurd or humorous aspects rather than taking ideological positions. This approach allowed him to remain relevant and topical while maintaining his carefully crafted position above the political fray. Carson's business approach to his relationships with guests was another carefully calculated aspect of his professional persona. Carson almost never socialized with guests before or after the show. Frequent interviewee Orson Welles recalled that Tonight Show employees were astonished when Carson visited Welles's dressing room to say hello before a show. This business-only approach wasn't necessarily unfriendly, but it was deliberate and consistent. The reasoning behind Carson's professional distance made perfect sense when you consider the demands of his job. As host of The Tonight Show, Carson had to interview thousands of different people over the course of his 30-year career. If he had tried to maintain personal relationships with even a fraction of his guests, it would have been overwhelming and potentially problematic. By keeping things professional, he could focus on doing his job well, without the complications that might come from mixing business with friendship. Despite his on-camera demeanor, Carson was introverted off-camera. He avoided most parties and was called the most private public man who ever lived. Dick Cavett recalled, "I felt sorry for Johnny in that he was so socially uncomfortable. I've hardly ever met anybody who had as hard a time as he did." This natural introversion probably made his professional distance from guests feel more comfortable and sustainable. The exception that proved the rule came with Carson's treatment of Orson Welles. Carson was a huge fan of the Citizen Kane star and broke his own rule to greet Welles before his show, much to the shock of his staff. This rare deviation from his normal practice shows that Carson's professional distance wasn't about disliking people or lacking appreciation for his guests. It was a practical approach to managing the enormous social and emotional demands of his position. Carson's business-focused approach also extended to his behavior during tapings. As one CBS profile noted, "There's Carson the performer, and there's Carson the private individual, and I can separate the two." When the cameras were rolling, Carson was fully engaged and charming. Musician John Oates recalled that he was very subdued, but the moment the countdown started, 3, 2, 1, and the lights came on the camera, he was Johnny Carson. He was like, boom. It was that pencil tapping thing with the coffee mug, and then the moment they went to a commercial, it was like he just stopped. This ability to turn his performance on and off like a switch was part of what made Carson such a professional. He understood that his job was to entertain the audience, not necessarily to become best friends with every guest who appeared on his show. This approach allowed him to maintain consistent quality in his performances while protecting his personal energy and privacy. One small but memorable detail about Carson's on-camera persona involved his habit of fidgeting with pencils during the show. Johnny regularly played with pencils at his Tonight Show desk, but there was some concern from producers that these sharp-pointed objects could prove to be dangerous either to Carson himself or one of his guests, so his staff replaced all of his regular writing implements with specially made pencils that had erasers on both ends. This detail was sometimes mentioned on the show itself, with Ed McMahon telling Carson that the authorities had taken away pointed objects because they were afraid Carson might hurt himself. "But how can I write with this?" Carson asked. "There's no need," replied McMahon. "You're a talker. You're not a writer." The pencil story perfectly captures something important about The Tonight Show's production. Even the smallest details were considered and managed by the professional team behind the show. Carson's fidgeting was a natural part of his on-camera personality, but rather than trying to stop it, the production team found a way to make it safer while preserving Carson's comfort and natural behavior. The show underwent a major logistical change in 1972 when production moved from New York City to Burbank, California. For its first decade, Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show was based at the RCA building at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, New York City, with some episodes recorded at NBC Studios in Burbank, California. On May 1, 1972, the show moved to Burbank as its main venue. This move wasn't just about changing locations. It represented a shift in the show's focus and approach. As journalist Sam Kashner described the move, Tonight Show producer Freddie DeCordova felt that they had exploited all the New York talent, and he convinced Carson that he should move to Los Angeles. Carson's preference for access to Hollywood stars caused the show's move to the West Coast. The move to California gave The Tonight Show much better access to movie stars, television performers, and other entertainment industry figures who were based in Los Angeles. The change was significant for both the show and for late-night television in general. New York had been the traditional home of network television, but Carson's move helped establish Los Angeles as equally important in the television landscape. The Tonight Show's success in Burbank helped pave the way for other major television productions to be based on the West Coast. The show's use of guest hosts became more systematic and frequent during Carson's tenure, particularly as his contract negotiations gave him more time off. Carson curtailed his hosting duties back to 3 nights per week by the 1980s. Among Carson's regular guest hosts were Joey Bishop, McLean Stevenson, David Letterman, David Brenner, and Joan Rivers, with his final regular guest host being his eventual successor, Jay Leno. Joey Bishop was Carsons' most frequent guest host early in the show's run, hosting 177 episodes. Joan Rivers hosted 93 times during the 1970s and 1980s, and served as Carsons' permanent guest host in the early 1980s. Other regular guest hosts included John Davidson and Bob Newhart, who each hosted 87 times, and David Brenner, who hosted 70 times. These guest hosting appearances often served as auditions for potential permanent hosting positions, either on The Tonight Show itself or on other programs. The guest host system worked well for Carson because it allowed him to take extended breaks from the demanding schedule of nightly television, while ensuring that The Tonight Show maintained its presence and quality. For the guest hosts, it provided valuable experience and exposure that often helped advance their careers. Many of the comedians who frequently guest hosted for Carson went on to have their own successful television shows. The permanent guest host arrangements became particularly important in the show's later years. Gary Shandling served as the choice pick for permanent guest host during 1987 and 1988, while Jay Leno took over that role for the final years of Carson's tenure, hosting hundreds of episodes and positioning himself as the natural successor when Carson eventually decided to retire. This systematic approach to guest hosting was another example of how The Tonight Show operated as a well-managed business and entertainment enterprise. Rather than just finding random substitutes when Carson needed time off, the show developed a stable of reliable performers who understood the format and could maintain the quality and consistency that audiences expected. This professional approach helped ensure that The Tonight Show remained a dominant force in late-night television throughout Carson's entire 30-year run.